This is Greg Troutline with Offshore Engineer TV, and we're very pleased to be joined today by Kevin Sligh, Senior, the Director, Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, BSEE, the regulator of all energy produced on the U.S. Outer Continental Shelf. We'll discuss the current state of energy production and the future state of wind energy development on the OCS. Sir, to begin, you became the BSEE Director almost exactly a year ago today. Looking back on your first year, what was the single BSEE accomplishment of which you're most proud and why?
Well, thank you, Greg. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you here today. I'll give you several different answers. The best day, from my perspective, being here as the director at BSEE has been when I onboarded a brand new deputy director who's a career SES. His name is Paul Wong. Paul came from FEMA, 17 years. He used to run the FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program. He has a huge background in crisis management and also from a risk and insurance perspective, running that fairly large program for FEMA. I figured we did some interviews and I figured Paul was the right person at the right time for the right job since I've onboarded. But then I also have to talk about the split rule, from a renewable standpoint, to be able to really differentiate ourselves from the work that the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management does on the leasing side and the permitting side. And now we actually have our work cut out for us as we now own the engineering reviews, what they call facility design reports, facility installation reports. And our focus is really on safety and enforcement and compliance on the Outer Continental Shelf when it comes to offshore wind moving forward.
But if we can just start it off, how do you see the U.S. offshore energy production changing today? And what are some of the key safety and environmental concerns from the BSEE's perspective?
As we start to now really focus on the first few projects, it's really these projects, their construction operating plans were approved by BOEM years ago. They went through the NEPA process, and now we're really getting to the point where we're starting to take a look at those engineering reports, those FDRs and FIRs. And if you understand the process, the COP, or that construction operation plan, is the envelope of what could be built from a turbine and electrical substation facility off the coast. And now we're really getting into what they really want to put on the Outer Continental Shelf. And if you go between a few years, technology changes, structurally, the monopiles that are placed underwater, and then the supporting beam that goes 300 feet up in the air, and even some of the blade sizes, they've now changed over those 3 or 4 years since the COP has been approved. So now we're having to go back and take a harder look at the FDRs and FIRs to make sure that they are sound and they are structurally safe and moving forward before we give a no objection to a FDR, FIR moving forward on those reviews. And then I want to really focus on not just the new technology, but just state up front, we're committed to this administration's 30 by 30, which is 30 gigawatts by 2030, and then 15 gigawatts by 2035 for floating offshore wind. We are hard and heavy into it. We are learning as fast. I don't want to say we're building the airplane while we're flying, but we're close to it, and we are exceeding our expectations on these first few projects moving forward.
So, you've referenced obviously offshore wind, and BSEE is, as of January, responsible for offshore wind too. What challenge does this bring to BSEE, and how is regulating offshore wind energy different compared to your usual work in the offshore oil and gas sector?
Really lay this out. While we are the lead for safety and environmental enforcement and compliance, our sister bureau, BOEM, is responsible for the leasing and the NEPA work that goes on. So in conjunction, we are both leads. We just have our respective lanes. And I would say, starting off now that the split has occurred, we are coordinating reviews, those FDRs and FIRs, those reviews are being coordinated between BSEE, BOEM, because they've had a lot of the lift on the first few projects from a COP perspective. And we've actually brought on the Army Corps of Engineers and their engineering expertise to help us do the facility design and facility installation reviews moving forward. So I would say that would probably revolve around one of the challenges that we have is, as offshore wind ramps up and Congress has provided us personnel to do the work, we're in the process of a huge hiring phase of building out and hiring on new engineers to be able to do the work, and also building out and creating standard operating procedures and notice to lessees to make sure that we're as transparent and communicating with industry as much as possible. Now, the second part of your question, from an oil and gas perspective and where they diverge, I just personally think that there's different risk profiles between oil and gas and offshore wind. And in the future, I will flag, carbon sequestration. We're currently working on a rule with BOEM to figure that piece out from a regulatory standpoint, different risk profiles. But ultimately, at the end, we're trying to deliver energy for our country, for the American people, and that we have to realize that there are different risk profiles associated with being able to provide that energy, no matter whether it's oil and gas. They have a different profile. From an oil and gas perspective, you're pulling, oil and gas out of the reservoirs underwater. It's a different profile from a risk perspective and the equipment they use. And now we're looking at offshore wind, where we're putting stationary structures on the outer continental shelf, and they're providing and generating electricity to these substations that then ultimately get tied into the grid. Totally different risk profile. Not as many folks will be on these wind turbines and these electrical substations, so that changes it a little bit. But that doesn't mean we need a hurricane to come through and just completely topple over a set of turbines, which could cause a challenge in moving forward to get this new industry off the ground. Totally different risk profiles, a lot alike, but a lot different.
We cover the global market, and there's obviously a high interest in the development of U.S. offshore wind, both domestically and globally. How does BSEE see offshore wind energy developing specifically in the coming 5 years?
Wow, great question, Greg. And just thinking of some of the numbers off the top of my head, I'll just give you, for instance, within the next 5 years, we're expecting approximately 24, 25 offshore wind projects on 19 leases to be in commercial operations or the late construction phase. And by 2028, up to almost like 2,000 turbines on the outer continental shelf in those 19 leases, along with 44 electrical substations offshore. So think of the floating production facilities in the Gulf of Mexico and off the coast of California, 44 of those alone off of the East Coast right now, knowing that we are just had a lease sale off of the West Coast and anticipating another lease sale down in the Gulf of Mexico that will provide energy in the out years, 7, 8, 9, 10 years down the road. And with that, we're really focusing on, this administration is really focusing on high paying union jobs and skilled positions to be able to build out all of the different needs that are going to occur on the outer continental shelf. We're going to stimulate local economies. We're going to make us less vulnerable to price swings on the open market, whether it's here domestically or even internationally.
So as you well know, there are challenges. There's always challenges, but what do you see as the primary challenges or hurdles to having offshore wind energy develop as you envision?
So, this industry's been around for a long term. Onshore here domestically, offshore internationally. There's a lot of regulatory insights that the international community can bring to bear and help us out with. But I always go back to my Coast Guard roots and my emergency management roots, where I spent some time in FEMA for a couple of years before I took this job. It's really coming up with consensus-based safety standards. That's going to be the challenge. So you have these different entities. You talk about American Clean Power. You talk about American Petroleum Institute. You talk about the Offshore Operators Committee here in the U.S. and individual other organizations that are all working on their own standards. So I've challenged my team to say, hey, we need to really get our arms wrapped around these safety standards that are current. We don't need one company like Equinor or Orsted or Dominion working on their own. We need to have a consensus-based safety standards that will then be incorporated by reference back into our new 285 reg that we anticipate and hope that we'll be putting out a notice of proposed rulemaking here by the end of the year.
So staying on that safety note, can you describe BSEE's process for conducting inspections of offshore energy production activities and specifically how it ensures adherence to those safety regulations?
Great question, Greg. I'm going to talk real quick about oil and gas. As you probably know, we have a lot of BSEE inspectors that go out on the road in the Gulf of Mexico and on the West Coast, and a few up in Alaska that go up to the North Slope. We have about 120 inspectors, a couple of helicopter contracts for the ones where we fly offshore to the rigs or to the floating production platforms to be able to do inspections. And those inspectors go out to do risk-based inspections based off of what we're hearing from industry, their safety culture, to be able to take a hard look at what's ongoing on the OCS from a safety perspective. Now, we're pretty much in the nascent stages of trying to build out what that's going to look like for offshore wind. Do we need that many inspectors to fly out to these turbines? I don't think so. Do we need inspectors to be able to go on to these electrical substations? Of course. What does that mean? Our inspectors are typically, boots on the ground. They have knowledge in mechanical engineering, electrical engineering. I'm assuming that once we get our program up and running for offshore wind, there'll be a different set of skills that will need to be able to go on these electrical substations that primarily work around electrical safety and making sure that we're not going to, potentially kill someone on these substations as they go on board to work on those electrical substations. But I don't see the need pretty much to go onto those turbines as much. We will make inspections. We haven't worked out the time frame from an annual or 2 or 3 year interval to need to go on to the actual turbines. So right now, we're currently working on an inspections program for offshore wind and hope to, we might not have 120 inspectors for offshore wind, but we will have an inspections program moving forward to make sure that the Outer Continental Shelf, as it relates to offshore wind and oil and gas, and in the future, carbon sequestration, stays as safe as possible.
We're all about technology here at Offshore Engineer. What do you see as some of the technological advancements that BSEE is currently looking at to improve the safety and environmental protection in offshore energy production?
So of course, I've outlined some of them already. Our future 285 rule that works and talks around safety from a renewable standpoint, and then also building out a program that supports inspections on the Outer Continental Shelf for offshore wind. But I will also highlight, we have a couple of proposed rules out there that are coming to fruition, hopefully sometime this year. And we could talk about high pressure, high temp, which is new technology that is, as industry starts to drill deeper and further offshore, we get in deeper water, we get in high and higher pressures, higher temperatures, and we want to make sure that that regime stays as safe as possible. Also, including the new well control rule, where we have a solid 7 provisions that we've proposed, and we're looking at figuring out and how to release that out in a final rule here in the coming months. So I would say, from a drilling perspective, we show it through our intent, our regulatory agenda, through high pressure, high temp, the well control rule. We also have a financial assurance rule that's about to be pushed out, and to include some of the work that we're doing over in the renewable space also.
What do you see as some of the challenges that the offshore energy industry as a whole will face in the coming years, and how is BSEE preparing to meet those challenges?
So that's a great question, Greg. We are at the epitome of where we need to be from a nascent industry, with the exception of maybe Europe. But everybody's trying to get into the game right now with offshore wind. So if you can imagine going from, I don't want to say from 0 to 60, but maybe 20 to 60 over the next 10 or 20 years. I mean, you have countries like, I think I was on a call with G Plus this morning, early morning call, supporting them, and they were talking about how they're not talking about North America. They're calling it the Americas now, because even, South American countries are getting in, Japan, Taiwan, all of these different countries around the world, Australia. But what that rapid fashion is bringing is a strain on the supply chain right now. So industry and the developers are going through a huge amount of churn over their supply chain. And it's not just supply chain, it's having the right amount of vessels that can do the offshore work, having the skilled, high-paying union jobs to be there when they're needed. So those are some of the challenges that industry is working on and trying to get in front of, in addition to, BSEE working on safety and enforcement and compliance. But it's my bureau, I would actually say our bureau as America, is being able to meet industry where they're at with respect to the changes that they're going through, being able to provide this new industry a foothold into helping us to get energy from a different space moving forward. And then I would also add is that, as we build out our workforces, from our perspective, is being a little bit closer to the projects in the future, being able to travel to some of these projects. Those are some of the challenges that we're working through. And I think we're going to get there. It's just going to take some time. Remember, I said we're kind of like building an airplane while we're flying. And I'm glad it's just a biplane and not a 737. So the pieces and the parts are few, but we're going to get there in a timely fashion, but we're going to do it safe.
I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit. It's also a risk and a safety concern, but a different one. What are some of the cybersecurity challenges that the offshore energy industry as a whole is facing today? And when you look at some of the risks, what are the potential consequences of a cyber attack on an offshore platform? And specifically, what is BSEE doing to address these challenges?
So I'll speak to the question in two parts. One, we'll talk about oil and gas, and the next we'll talk about offshore wind. So last summer, when I got on board, GAO sent out a report with some recommendations for BSEE to take a look at offshore oil and gas from a cybersecurity perspective. As you know, a few years ago, we had the Colonial Pipeline incident that really severely curtailed the amount of gasoline on the East Coast for quite a bit of time, that where DOT PHMSA had to work through those challenges, along with, CISA and the normal DHS entities trying to figure out, and be prepared for the next incident. So we're at the point right now where we're actively building out a cyber strategy here in BSEE as it pertains to being a regulator. Now, as you know, the industry players maintain their own systems. So we've been in this mode since, I want to say, October, November. We've been having conversations, not only within the federal interagency with like CISA, DHS CISA, and the DOE CSAR folks, to include, I'm talking to the Coast Guard as soon as I get off this interview to talk about their cyber concerns. And we're moving into a space where we're actually starting to make visits to some of the industry players down in Houston to take a look at their EOCs, their Emergency Operations Center, to understand what they're actually using and making sure that they have the adequate resources within their business units to be able to handle cyber. I made a few visits here in the last month, and what I can say from my perspective, I think industry knows and gets it. There may be a few players out there, a few of the mids or the mom and pop entities, which I'm more concerned about than the larger players. But from what I'm seeing, oil and gas is they understand the threat and they understand the risk. And I think that I know they're putting, major amounts of dollars to make sure that they can protect their brands and protect the environment and the safety of personnel offshore. Now let's move to offshore wind. These facilities, these electrical substations, as they come cabled in through the turbines, they're going to be connected into the grid. So in addition to that GAO recommendation, we're not only looking at oil and gas, we're also looking and talking to developers, offshore wind developers, about their connections to the grid. What are their infrastructure concerns? Now that they're starting to put steel and concrete in the water, what are some of the things that they need to start thinking about from a cybersecurity perspective? Are they using closed wireless systems on board, which would be, a great opportunity to make sure that there's no way to hack into some of these systems offshore? Maybe some can't, but we are starting to have those conversations with offshore wind developers on their cybersecurity concerns too.
Can you discuss BSEE's efforts to train and equip its workforce? I know we talked about the number of inspectors, but to train and equip that workforce to assess and manage the challenges related to offshore energy production, and quite frankly, with the addition of offshore wind, I know you talked about staffing up, but do you have enough people to manage the workload?
We're growing great, and I'm just going to say right now, our most valuable asset is our workforce, our team players, and everything that we can do to get everything that they need is critical. Now, we also have something called the National Offshore Technical Center, NOTC, that's run out of the Gulf. They produce about 23,000 contact hours per year on training, and it's everything from oil and gas to offshore wind, now even carbon sequestration courses. So we are preparing our folks for work in the future and currently doing the same thing right now. We also have an inspector OJT course that leads to the inspector certification also. So we are really leaning into making sure our team is ready all the time to be able to go out and do inspections and look at it from a safety perspective.
How does BSEE balance the need for energy production with its responsibility for safety and environmental stewardship?
Well, this is where I get a chance to plug the work that we do from an Environmental Justice 40 initiative. That's a presidential initiative. We also, when I onboarded, we started up something called the National Tribal Engagement Program, NTEP. I was like, well, wait a minute, we're the Department of Interior, and our consultation process lags a little bit beyond our sister bureau. We need to have our own staff that are dedicated to providing an opportunity for Native tribes to be able to comment on some of these heady projects from a carbon sequestration. We're going to have pipelines pushing supercritical liquids through and basically disadvantaged neighborhoods in the future that will go offshore to then inject CO2 into the outer continental shelf. We need to make sure that we're having these conversations with these communities up front. And then, of course, we go back to the workforce and our ability to, really work with minority serving institutions. They don't just have to be HBCUs. They can be Hispanic serving organizations, AAPI organizations. We're trying to be all inclusive from a minority serving institution perspective. So those are some of the things that we're making sure that we cover down to ensure, we're safe as possible. We are providing adequate compliance on the outer continental shelf, and where we need to, we enforce the regs that we have in place.